it's been reported over the past day, in the past several hours actually, that basically, and it was reported by a site out of the UK called Middle East Eye that I've written for a little bit, that Tony Blair, in his time as the envoy for the Quartet, which are the sort of peace envoy to the Middle East for Israel-Palestine, for the Quartet partners, and in his subsequent time since resigning that post, which he did a couple of weeks ago, that he's held meetings off the record with the political director of Hamas in an attempt to develop a strategy to reopen Gaza. It's surprising. Neither side has denied it. Blair's people haven't denied it yet. As of this show, Hamas's people haven't denied it. That's clearly happening with the approval of Israel and other stakeholders. Now, I don't think anything will come of this really fundamentally without a broader plan to actually move a process forward for dismantling of settlements, for durable security arrangements, and for a cessation of the blockade on Gaza, as well as commitments on security from Palestinians towards Israel. There's a lot that needs to be done. Obviously, in Israel right now, you have a government where they're not going to do anything, period. It's a far-right government, and it's very questionable if even the so-called left in Israel would actually take any action to uproot the status quo, which is a threat to security and obviously a violation to human rights and a threat to Israel as well, if you think about it strategically. But what's fascinating about this story, and one of the reasons I wanted to highlight it, is because in terms of Western coverage of Hamas, now I condemn Hamas on pretty much any level imaginable. It's a right-wing religious political party in many respects. Its social policies are repressive. It has absolutely engaged in acts of terrorism, and I categorically condemn any actor, any faction, no matter who they are, who intentionally targets civilians or has reckless disregard for civilians, period. That obviously includes Hamas. But the reality of Hamas in Western discourse is, it's used as a bogeyman to distract from the bigger issues. Hamas is not the issue. Hamas is not any type of prime power. And what you see by Blair being willing to negotiate with them is that Blair, who is obviously extremely to the right on these issues, and Israel's implicit acceptance is the fact that in reality, even as that they want to undermine Hamas, Hamas is, as one senior Israeli official actually said a couple of weeks ago, a frenemy to Israel. Because the reality is that inside Gaza, Hamas has clamped down on other groups that are targeting Israel. And ever since they've governed Gaza in 2006, they have drastically reduced violent activities. They've still engaged in some. It's still completely unacceptable. But the reality of what they are as a group, functionally, has mostly been as a cautious sort of player preserving its own power in Gaza. Now, that's not great for anybody involved, but the reality of that group is that when people talk about them as being like ISIS or being another absolutely obscene actor that you really have no sort of point of reference to negotiate with, it's ludicrous. And now to have Tony Blair, who plays a very ambiguous role in the region, to say the least, negotiating with Hamas, I think really is a pretty clear indicator of where policy needs to go here and how also Israeli policy makers need to cop to the reality of what Hamas is, which is a group that there's nothing wrong with having a strategy to undermine, but it is not a group that you simply cannot do business with. In fact, I do think fundamentally that the reason Blair is negotiating and the purpose of these negotiations is fundamentally to undermine Hamas in the long term, because the notion is that if you normalize Gaza somewhat and you sort of move the blockade somewhat, well, there really isn't that much political appeal in Hamas. I mean, Hamas has not delivered in many ways for the population of Gaza. But fundamentally, at this point, Israel has not followed through on any of its international commitments with regards to this issue. And in the West Bank, you have a ultra-moderate, ultra-centrist, the only faction left in this entire game that supports the so-called peace process, which is the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, who are Israeli security subcontractors in the West Bank, period. That's it. They are an ancillary aid to Israeli security, period. And even in Gaza under Hamas, relatively speaking to the other factions there, Hamas keeps it cool, which is, of course, not to mention an entire siege and blockade, which has enormous humanitarian consequences and is really sort of the larger picture. But if these negotiations can lead to any type of improvement in the humanitarian situation and at least to some political reality building about the need to include Hamas, just as we've included any number of other groups that have committed horrors and atrocities in conversations, because that's politics. Like, sorry to be rude, but get real. Very few situations in any international conflict where you are not going to be talking to people who've committed war crimes, committed atrocities. And obviously that goes for every side of the conflict.